Okay, so welcome everyone who is here in person in the Kislak Center in the Van Pelt Library at the University of Pennsylvania, and to all of you who are zooming in from remote points and leaping into the future to those of you who may be catching up with us later on YouTube. I'm Jerry Singerman. I'm the Humanities Editor Emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania Press, and one of the co-organizers of these workshops, along with Zachary Lesser, who's the Edward W. Kane Professor of English at Penn, and who should wave, okay, and John Pollack, who's the Curator for Research Services here in the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts. And there he is. We, in turn, are organized by Isla Malcolm, who is the Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Texts, and from whom you all get your emails. So it's a special pleasure today to welcome our two speakers, Andrew Stauffer and Amanda Licastro, who will speak on book traces, library history, and the marks of collaborative reading. Andy Stauffer is Professor of English at the University of Virginia, where he focuses primarily on Romantic and Victorian poetry and the history of the book. He's author of Anger, Revolution, and Romanticism, published by Cambridge University Press in 2005, and he is co-author as a member of the Multigraph Collective of Interacting with Print, Elements of Reading in the Era of Print Saturation, published by Chicago in 2018. With Veronica Alfano, he's the co-editor of the volume Virtual Victorians, Networks, Connections, Technologies, which appeared from Palgrave in 2015, and he's currently working on a new biography of Lord Byron for Cambridge. He's associate editor of the Victorian Literature and Culture series at the University of Virginia Press, past director of NINE's Network Infrastructure for 19th Century Electronic Scholarship at Virginia, and he's president of the Byron Society of America. Now, long before any of this, I'm happy to report that he was an undergraduate English major at the University of Pennsylvania, but that's not really the reason why we invited him back today. Yeah. So in 2014, Stauffer established the web-based Book Traces project, which he still directs, established with Kristen Jensen of the University of Virginia Library as project manager, and in collaboration with partner libraries, an advisory board of scholars from across the US, Canada, the UK, and Denmark, and individual participants and contributors who now number in the thousands. Funded in part by the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the Council on Library and Information Resources, and the University of Virginia, Book Traces is dedicated to discovering, cataloging, and preserving individual copies of marked up 19th and early 20th century books that are, from a librarian's perspective, not rare, but merely old and undistinguished, trash, if you will, and that constitute, from a book tracer's perspective, a massive and hugely informative archive of the history of reading and book use, a treasure that we are in danger of losing. To find out more and to get a real and, let me add, often moving sense of the stakes, I commend to your attention Stauffer's deeply engaging 2021 Penn Press material texts volume titled What Else? Book Traces, 19th Century Readers and the Future of the Library. Amanda Licastro is the Director of Pedagogical Initiatives at Book Traces, where she helps faculty and students develop, adapt, and implement book history projects through the materials available via the Book Traces enterprise. This is but a side gig for her, however, for in her day job, she is our colleague here at Penn, where she is the Emerging and Digital Literacy Instructional Designer in the university libraries, a role in which she provides instructional design support around emerging technologies, both within the library itself and across multiple campus units. Licastro came to Penn in, I think it was 2020, okay?
The pandemic.
Okay, in the pandemic, from Stevenson University in Maryland, where she was assistant professor of digital rhetoric. She holds a doctorate degree in English with a certificate in interactive technology and pedagogy from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And she's co-founder of the Journal of Interactive Technology and Pedagogy, where she serves on the editorial collective. And she's co-editor with Ben Miller of Composition and Big Data, which appeared last year with the University of Pittsburgh Press. Now, before I hand the floor over to Andy and Amanda, a bit of housekeeping. I'd like to ask everyone who's here in person to be sure to sign the attendance sheet as it goes around the room. This is helpful to us in keeping track of how many people are attending these sessions from week to week, but it's also required as an instrument of contact tracing in these COVID times. Now, for those of you who are Zooming in, I ask that you please be sure to mute your microphones for now, but please feel free to enter comments in the chat, which Eileen will be curating. And once the floor opens for discussion, please use either the chat or the raise hand function to pose your questions and comments. And a final note, I want to remind everyone that this is the last regular session of the workshop in the history of material texts for the current academic year. But I understand that there will be a highly irregular session next week. Now, I know very little about what's planned, but I assure you all that I'm very eager to attend. But now, Andy and Amanda, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jerry. And there's so many people to thank. Book Traces really takes a village, and we owe a lot to the library staff here, not just John and Zachary and Jerry from Material Texts, but also the Libra people who brought all these books back. You might be able to see the people in the room have all these books in front of them, and we'll talk a little bit about why those are there and where this all came from. But Aaron and Katya and Eric brought about 250 19th century books back from Libra, from remote storage today for us to look at with students. And Amanda will talk a little bit more about that later. But I thought what I would do, and I'm going to share my screen, is just do a kind of a little backstory on what Book Traces is, and show some examples of things we've found and why it matters to me and sort of to literary history, I think, and also to thoughts about the future of library and library policy, particularly in regard to print collections and print collections management. So this is the kind of stuff we're talking about. Those of you in the room don't need to look at the slide. You have it all in front of you. But older books printed mostly in the 19th century in circulating collections of academic research libraries, not rare books, but books that for various reasons ended up in the circulating stacks and on the shelves of American libraries. And we can talk about why that's the case, how that archive developed, but it's a kind of an accident of institutional history. Anyway, we have these books now. And it's become clear through the past, almost a decade of book tracing that I've been doing, first casually and then more seriously, that about 10% of these books printed in the 19th century on American library circulating shelves have marks and writing in them by their original owners and readers from that era. And so what we've sort of been trying to track or develop is a way of cataloging and registering the existence of these books as part of the history of middle-class reading in the United States, and a kind of a real testament to that, hidden in plain sight and now under threat based on changes in library print collections policies. So I'm not going to go through all this, but we don't look for marks made by library patrons. So that if you're thinking about we're tracking writing in library books, that's not, it's writing that was in them before they came in. And that's part of the deal. So I'm just going to go through some examples to try to draw out why this is important for literary history and what these books can tell us that we can't really otherwise see clearly about 19th century books as media objects. And for me, I'm mostly a scholar of poetry, and so most of my examples are going to be poetic ones. But the searching we've done has been across all subject areas as long as they were printed before 1923. And again, we can talk about why that date. Anyway, this just Exhibit A. Here we go. A copy of this book, of this poem, Geraldine, a Souvenir of the St. Lawrence. It's a long narrative poem, kind of modeled to draw on the success of Lucille, which was the Bulwer-Lytton poem that went through so many editions. Geraldine was kind of a knockoff. This is a copy at the University of Louisville that we found when we were searching there with students. And you can only see one page here, but this book has been marked up by 5 different young women. Their names are all in it, commenting in detail about what's happening in the poem and whether they approve of the characters' decisions or not, whether they think it's a good line of poetry or not. This is a social media page, no question about it. You can kind of see, they're doubting, I doubt whether she is sincere, and I rather suspect her of being a trained flirt, says one. And then the other one's like, it's hard to tell whether she is simply acting a part or showing the real language of her heart, etc. And they're talking back and forth. Again, this is just one page of really a fascinating book, and you begin to see into a world of poetic reading and consumption, particularly female reading here, that often isn't well attested in our special collections and rare book rooms. And so this copy really stood out. There's more to be said about the ways they read, and I say more in the book, but this is the same book. It was the owner of the book is this woman, Esther Annie Brown. She is the actual owner of the book, although she circulated in this friend group or this reading club. But she also makes some personal notations in here. It's something that in another context I call the date stamped book. This is a passage about the end of love, and she has written in the margin January 19th, 82. And it's about not looking back at the past, which is interesting because it's clearly a date where something important happened. So there's this personalizing adoption of poetry as a language of the heart or a language for one's own subjectivity. Again, in the same book, if you turn it sideways, something happened in January 82. Leaves from the Rose Room to hear Faust, January 82, next to this passage about we must follow the line of our separate fates. There's some kind of personal, trouble in the heart or trouble in her personal biography that's here happening in the midst of, if you turn it the other way, the women are still arguing about whether this is good or whether she should have left or not. So, there's different layers of use of this book. And I just find it a really fascinating, again, a media object that tells us something about the way poetry was consumed during this period in ways that may be unfamiliar to us now, this kind of personalization, this, and yet is familiar in certain ways as social media coming back from in an analog age in the way that the comments on comments and all of that. Another example sort of along these same lines, this one from Columbia. And these are all books from different libraries. And I want to emphasize that this isn't just one little collection. These are things that have come up from all kinds of institutions. This is a copy of Thomas More's poetry, Juliana Shields Haskell, her copy, and it's heavily annotated as well. Here, RELB, March 26, 1893. Oh, had we never met, or could this heart even now forget? And the book tells us a lot more about this relationship. If you open, it's Robert E. Lee Barnum. We know him. They met in Savannah one summer. You can do genealogy on the fly now with the digital resources we have, and you can figure out what was happening in their lives at this time. They also both wrote in the book. So she writes Savannah 3/25/93 in that left-hand margin, RELB. He's all truth, strength, and purity. She's applying those lines from Moore to him. And then he writes, the sentiment with which you here associate me, I know is but the emanation of a gentle nature and a pure life. And like the sweet perfume of a delicate flower is, well, it's been trimmed for library rebinding, and we've lost the bottom bit of that. But there is this, sort of trading, texting back and forth in the margins. Here we can see them doing it again. She has bracketed, I am not thine, thank God, thank blank, and he in German, gut for danke. Like they're teasing and flirting with each other. Or here, is this not true happiness? No, yes. So the book, there's these little scenes of readership. You can see it happening. They must have been sitting next to each other and sort of both writing in the book at the same time. So again, kind of really bringing out the social aspect of reading and how poetry became part of the operating system of people's lives, a language for engagement, for sociability, for one's private heart, and you see it happening here in the moment on the page, not just someone talking about that happening, but in these very specific cases. Somebody even cuts one of the stanzas out. This is the same book, Thomas More, probably to put in a scrapbook, or I don't know. And this is another one of her books. So what's interesting about the Book Traces method, or the way it proceeds, of course, these books were all donated to university libraries, but there wasn't just one book at a time. They came in as whole libraries that were donated, right? So we also found Juliana Haskell's guidebook when she traveled in Italy with her husband, who was not Ariel Barnum. She married Henry Haskell. And here's their trip through Italy in the early part of the 20th century, in the 30s. keeping track of how much they spent on Chianti and various things. So we see Juliana as a young woman, 18 years old, flirting with RELB in the same, and then in the same library you find other books that speak across to pieces of the life. Another example, just because I always talk about this one, that's one of my favorites from UVA, John H. Adamson, Christmas '92. Underneath that, Jane C. Slaughter, 1900. They both, it's sort of a co-owned book. It was donated to UVA after Jane Chapman Slaughter's death in the 60s. But what's happened here, and again, it's a heavily annotated book. I don't have time to go through the whole thing, but the two were reading this poetry of Longfellow together, and sort of falling in love over the book. And then he went away on a mission and never came back. And so there's two layers of annotation. Her younger hand, where she's writing in the book to try to remember and document for him what they read together. And then later her re-encountering her own annotations and re-annotating. So on the left, they've just read this poem, The Skeleton in Armor, about a ghostly Viking that wins the love of a blue-eyed maid. And she says, now you looked at your watch and said, then you looked at your watch and said, now shall we go and make that visit? For at 5 o'clock, I have to go to Washington. And we meant you and I, and we had a happy walk. And then you can tell the handwriting is altered on that other page. It's her coming back to the book. That was our last walk together in this world, never to see each other more, never, oh never. It was after this I called you Norseman, the name we always used to the end in our letters. Do you remember? You added to it your Norseman and your devoted Norseman. And it's just odd that she's still addressing him in the second person. Do you remember? Yeah. And so I've been really interested in these books as vessels of memory and as kind of mirrors of memory, to what extent that memory is being worked out as a process on the page and within the shape of the codex. This is the same book. You read this July 1st, Sunday, the day you said goodbye, sitting in the great armchair in the infirmary parlor, oh friend of mine. And then later she's come back and said, once mine, now mine no more. And it's on a poem that's about when the forms of the departed enter in the evening. And so it's a Longfellow poem, Footsteps of Angels, that's involved with the same way of thinking. And so it's not just that they're using blank paper to write these things. I'm really interested in the intersection between the printed text and the handwritten, and that's an obvious point, I guess. But it's not just something you wrote on a blank piece of paper. It's partly a combined scene of type and hand. Oh, and there she is. So another point here is that a lot of these books, we have the family papers in special collections, but these books just looked like cheap, boring copies of unrare books and ended up in the circulating collections. And so what this protocol can do is reunite things that actually belong together. Some of it ended up in special collections because they were rare books. Some ended up in general. But in fact, the most interesting thing in the Slaughter papers is this volume of Longfellow, because it's a full sort of outpouring of 2 stages of her life, and very kind of naked in that way. And the papers are fine, but the book belongs there, and it's there now. So another example, because I like telling stories. This one's also good, and it helps me understand again what poetry is doing. That I love it when the poem itself seems to be meditating on marginalia or meditating on the book. This is a poem by Pred from Louisville, a copy in Louisville, Mary Cosby's copy, and it's this poem, this very sort of dark poem that ends the last stanza, indelibly within all I have lost is written. And she, Mary Cosby, again, has kind of gone back to this book as an older woman. It's marked with things that going to a party when she was younger, and there's actually a young man's hand in there saying, please don't leave, it's too early. And then she's come back to it later, and you see the note, the sort of plangent note that she's written underneath this poem, one of Pred's few dark poems. He's usually a kind of lighthearted poet, but this one's dark. I read this book years ago, a bright, joyous, happy girl, life was all before me, and I wondered that there could be a heart sad enough to write these lines. Now long years have passed, I again take up this book. The best part of my life is past. The bright, happy girl is changed into a lonely, broken-hearted woman, and of all that is written here, the above is the truest expression of her feelings. Amazing, and it shows how the book books stayed in one's possession through the course of a life and offered repeated places of resort. And it wasn't in one and you read it and you got rid of it. They stayed in homes. Books were cheap enough for people to buy. Middle-class people could buy more books than just a small family library, but they were still valuable enough that they stuck around. They stayed in households, they stayed with people, and they ended up moving into institutional libraries when that person passed away because it was still they were valuable enough to be counted as an asset and not a liability as people's libraries often are now. And nobody wants them anymore. So there's a way that you're really touching, you feel like you're touching the edge of a life with a lot of these books, and touching the hands of the dead, and maybe the metaphor of this kind of historicist project. And here's some actual traced hands of schoolgirls teasing each other while they should be studying their Shakespeare. They're at a private school, Madame Chegary's famous sort of private school in New York. That's all attested to in the book. And it says, Ruthie Whitehead's ugly hand, oh no, I mean beautiful one. It says it's just, I think they're tracing each other's hands, one's left and one's right. Anyway, in a copy of Shakespeare, but there's something evocative about that with the date deuce slip kind of through the torn page at the back, kind of emblem for the whole project. But you actually find pieces of Victorians in the books, hair, right? There we go. Locks of hair are actually, more common than you might think. And but it's weird that these are circulating books. They've been sitting on the shelf, able to be checked out. They could have, all of the stuff could have fallen out at any point, and yet sometimes it's still there because a lot of these books, they came onto the shelf and then never moved. They failed as circulating books. They came to build volume counts. They became because large bequests came in, but no student or faculty member ever really wanted this birthday book. If you see it on the screen, a Whittier birthday book, is not really a research object or even a reading object for a modern student, and so it's maintained. It's there to preserve these things that were left inside them. This is the cover of the Book Traces book that Jerry mentioned, but the Victorian dog clothes, an 1833 copy of Walter Scott's, I think it's The Life of Napoleon. And it's sort of antebellum fashion. You can see the little doll clothes that someone made and stored in the book. Again, evocative of all those readers that we're trying to get back in touch with or trying to, in some ways, evoke. Okay, so other stuff we find in there. Plants. We found some today. In fact, we'll show you later. Amanda will talk about this, but people put botanical material in books, and not just flowers, but leaves and all sorts of things. And this one is particularly interesting to me because you can see it's stitched in there. It's not just a leaf that happened to find its way into a book as a bookmark or something like that, or as to flatten it for a scrapbook. You sometimes see that. But here, that little sprig has been stitched into the page, a poem called The Death of a Child. And my guess is that that's probably a sprig from the grave or from something that was left at the grave. It has some personal association with Horatio, Deborah Adams' son, who died at the age of 14. That's my guess. This was Deborah Adams' copy. This is at the University of Miami. Again, when I say these names, you don't know who they are. Neither do I. They're nobodies, right? These aren't famous people's books. This is just, given the fact that we now have genealogy databases and Google Books and so many things you can search, I can find out who Deborah Adams is. I can find out who her children were. I can make educated guesses about what was happening in her life when she altered the book in this way. And again, the poem itself seems to be about marginalia in a way, a kind of sublime form. In heaven, I will see him, and I'll see written on his brow a kind of divine marginalia. Thou shalt see me there. There's something about the face, the facing pages and the writing on the face. I love when the examples start to harmonize or resonate in that way. Yeah, flowers in books, and I've also become interested in the way they become these kind of design experiments. They deform the page in these kind of beautiful, half grotesque ways as the botanical matter gives up its acid and its liquid and all of that. The page starts to make a kind of one-off print of it as in the folded over. You'll see this in the one we found at Penn today, same deal. But there's something really evocative about this. Someone want to do a coffee table book with me, I'm open to, because they really are beautiful. The halls of memory, they start to resonate as art objects almost to me. as visual art objects and design fields rather than simply semantic meaning. And maybe I just looked at too many, but that's how I was starting to see them lately. This one particularly interesting because the flower itself has marginalia. This is again from Miami, the Changed Cross and other religious poems. It has a death notice pasted in it too. I think I have a zoom of that. Charles Deering's wife Annie died in childbirth 1 year into their marriage, and this book sort of becomes a memorial to her. Again, the staples of the sort of the way the flower is pasted in there with those little staples suggests that it has something to do with Annie herself. The annotation, I think, says Annie, December 20th, 1877, probably a record of a Christmas time visit to her grave a year after her death or something like that. But it seems like it's connected, obviously, to Annie's death. And there's a good reason, because this book was the book that Annie had read to her on her deathbed. As the book tells us, the inscriptions here, a short time before her death, Annie asked her mother to read this poem, saying she often thought of it, and her mother read it in the presence of those gathered around the deathbed, as Annie herself tried to read it here, but her sight failed. "I guess I can't read it," she said, smiling. So this is all within that same book that's become, a kind of, what, a missile, a souvenir, I don't know. I sort of expressed this in the book. At a certain point where you're sort of like, what are these things anymore? You can't really call them. They're not the same as they were. They've been transfigured. They've been changed, like the Changed Cross. There's some kind of process that they go through this investment of memorialization. And anyway, that one really is a haunting one in a number of ways. And again, all of this from circulating stacks. These are not rare books. So you can go to Miami and check that book out and take it home with you. And so partly I'm trying to raise awareness of the fact that there is this kind of material in the stacks. Just as a footnote to that waif, it's not just about reception history, because you see there's a feedback loop. You look at that copy of the waif from 45, and now look at that copy of Wordsworth from 85. And what the illustrator there is doing is reflecting a half century of more than that. It's, almost a century of practice, more than that. But you know what I mean, that there's a way that the book has started to pre-print the insertion for you. And it's even stitched in there with that same little, paper stitch. If you want, there's the pansy at my feet doth the same tale repeat, whither is fled the visionary gleam. Where is it now, the glory in the dream? Well, the pansy's right there. You don't have to go looking for it. We've pre-printed it in there. And so I like it. In other words, I think you can learn something about the way poetry was packaged and even written in anticipation of certain kinds of readerly actions, which included things like putting flowers in the book. Okay, so let's back out from examples. I could tell those stories all night. If you want to read more, you should get the book. There's a lot more in there. But anyway, this whole project started kind of in the wake of Google Books and downstream effects of mass digitization of print. And one of the big consequences of that has been print collections management at scale. That is, now that we have first of all, we know we have digital catalogs of all of our collections, so we can kind of look for overlap. And we mostly, for 19th century books, have digital scans of a copy on HathiTrust or Google Books or Internet Archive. Not by all means all, but most of the books that are in university libraries were scooped up by Google, and if they're out of copyright, they were put online. All that by way of saying is you have less reason to go into the stacks to get these books that I've been talking about, even were you to want them. You can get a copy pretty quickly. So these are pictures of the Google Books trucks taking the books out of my library, University of Virginia, Alderman, and taking them off to be scanned. And of course they brought them back, but they were on a different footing when they came back, for reasons that are all very familiar to us now. This is a library catalog. If you want to get poems by Hemans, 1826, you search for it, there it is. You can look at the Google preview, the HathiTrust preview, or you can go into the stacks and actually go dig that thing up. Well, motivated by convenience, if not exactly preference, most people will click on one of those two things. Well, you click on Google and you get the Stanford copy, and you click on Hathi and you get, I think that's the Michigan copy, for whatever reason. But if you go into the stacks, source, you find one that is a unique copy that was, given to Elizabeth Lane, et cetera, et cetera. You get the point. But there's a kind of way that the instant availability of those scanned copies are driving the print copies even more into shadow. And that's not evil. It's just a downstream effect of a kind of intervening in an ecosystem of information. There's going to be winners and losers in that world, and the print copies are sort of losing out. So just a few stats from the history of the project, but we looked at 115,000 books at UVA. We had a grant to do that, and we found out that about 12% of them had marks that we could confidently trace to a 19th century reader or owner or something like that, which was higher than we expected, actually. We thought it might be a rare occurrence, but really is about 12% across the collection. And in different call numbers, it's higher, right? In certain call numbers, it's lower. And so we were like, okay, well, is this a unique thing to UVA? Maybe it's just institutional history. Our library burned around the turn of the century. Maybe we just developed this oddball collection, but no. So that's when I started booktraces.org, which I encourage you to visit. And Amanda will talk a little bit about more in a second. But we just wanted people to tell us if they could find these things at their libraries, and they did. And so we then realized, okay, this is a thing. This isn't just local. Let's start doing more outreach and visits like this one to see what the national picture is across different kinds of institutions. And so we've visited all those places on your screen. You can see a wide range of type of institution, everything from large state, large private, small private, Eastern Mennonite, Virginia HBCUs, and we're trying to get, again, this is a very small subset of schools we might go to, but they're ones we've managed to, and virtually at every one of those places, we found the same rough rate of hit, that is about 12%, and different pockets of interest and different examples. And so that really showed us that this was a national thing, not just a local bubble at UVA. So these are just some pictures of what that looks like today. We had Whitney students come look at this. This is an early example of us doing this. There's Amanda, my co-presenter, looking in the stacks for these kinds of traces, and it's really fascinating to then talk with the students about what they're seeing and to make these original humanities research discoveries with them. We're not hiding Easter eggs for them to find. We literally come help us, because there's only one way to find this stuff, and it's book by book, page by page, hands on the volume. These books are cataloged, of course, but they're not cataloged. This material is not cataloged in any way, and so you have to do a hands-on kind of thing. So I'm gonna pass it over to Amanda now, and I'm just gonna stop sharing for a sec, and then I will share again the Book Traces site that she's going to talk about. And you will take my seat. Yes, great. Thank you.
Screen okay, everything great? Wonderful. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. We're going to switch gears only slightly. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I came to this project and what we've been working on. So back in 2014, I was a graduate student at the CUNY Graduate Center working with David Greetham, and Andy was actually a fellow working on this project. So as a graduate teaching instructor, I brought my students to one of the very first book traces stack searches at Columbia University. Now, my students were wildly unprepared for this kind of work because CUNY does not have a research library. Right? We do not have a rich collection of rare books or special materials or even circulating stacks for that matter. So my students were very intimidated by the research library, especially Columbia's library. If you've ever been there, you might share in that intimidation. So when we went, I really saw my students, their perspective change on book history, their perspective change on academic libraries in really profound ways. In fact, many of them, and remember this was in 2014, said that they felt like they were in Harry Potter, right? Exploring this mystical place full of hidden treasures. And their work afterwards, after the stack search, was deeply and heavily influenced by that experience. They started making connections between what they found and social media. You heard Andy say that the birthday book is a lot like a social media object, right? It catalogs everyone's birthday. You can reference it to see when your friends' birthdays are. There's, personalized messages from people to each other. My students kept saying that they felt like the marginalia was like email or like Twitter or like Facebook posts on someone's Facebook page. And what I realized is that they weren't wrong. They were exactly right. And in fact, it went further than that. So at the same time, around 2014, there was a rise in what I call social annotation. And these social annotation tools are now familiar to most of you because we've been using them during the pandemic, right? So this is hypothesis, perusal. We also have many ebooks within library sites that have collaborative annotation functions. University of Minnesota and other presses have this now built into their digital texts. And the idea here is that on digitized texts, you have the ability to write to each other collaboratively about that text. Easiest way to think about this is if you bring up your Kindle app and it says 492 people have highlighted this sentence, right? In my article about my work on book traces, I actually looked at a Kindle edition of Orwell's 1984, and there were over 4,000 annotations to that digital edition, right? So you hear constantly instructors lamenting, my students don't read, my students don't annotate, my students don't take good notes. But here we have proof that the general public has annotated a digital version of 1984 4,000 times, right? So it's just not true. They're just annotating in different ways than maybe we expect, right? So this led me down a rabbit hole of connecting the history of social annotation, which we have evidence for right here on the Book Traces site, to the modern ways in which we're helping students learn how to read difficult text and really finding evidence of the kind of reading they're doing to be better instructors, to be better teachers of literature. So we've been doing these Book Traces searches where we bring students into the stacks where they get their hands quite literally dirty, right? They end up with dust on their hands after doing these stack searches, but then the pandemic hit and we can't go into stacks and we can't go into universities and we can't do these kinds of in-person events. This is our first in-person event in 2 years, yeah, right? That we're doing today. So we developed this site. I joined the board of Book Traces several years ago, and then when we saw this greater need, I joined as the pedagogical director, and we built out this site to give instructors a grab and go, plug and play, easy way to integrate Book Traces into their courses. And this is not just for book history courses. This could be in a history course. It could be, we've had faculty across the disciplines use this in really interesting ways. So I'm going to walk you through a couple of these examples. So the first is probably maybe the most obvious example, and that's the transcription assignment. So in this case, you're having students, find examples here on our Book Traces site of marginalia that they can identify and have them do that transcription work. David Greetham used to do this assignment in my course, back when I was in graduate school, where he'd bring in manuscripts and have us, write them out. We've of course updated and suggested that you could TEI encode, right, these transcriptions as well. And this assignment leads instructors through exactly like what readings they might preface this with, what kind of questions they're going to ask students, and what kind of outcomes, what kind of products they might make from this transcription assignment. This would be a very classic literary history course or DH course that you might do this. But you can also see that you can do some of the historical research that Andy alluded to with using perhaps the Oxford English Dictionary or other resources to kind of trace histories, find out what's happening in the marginalia. So the next course we have, or the next example we have, is more of the genealogy assignment. So here again, we provide background readings on kind of why you might want to do this work. But here what we're looking at is, can you find like one specific donor or one specific owner and kind of trace, exactly as Andy just did in his beautiful examples, kind of trace their history across reading. So you can find, and we have found entire family histories in some of these texts. We have found instances where mothers are passing the text to daughters, who are passing the text to granddaughters, etc. And you can really trace someone's history. in some really beautiful ways. So this kind of leads students through that, including sample essay assignments based on what they found and how they might go through that genealogical work. And then we have featured instructors. So we take instructors who have already successfully implemented this work into their classroom. This one is from Kathy Harris, a fellow CUNY alum, who's did a stack search assignment and has her students basically go through the stack search without us there, right? Because she's already been through it a couple times. So we feature these assignments periodically by folks who have done this successfully. And you can see exactly how they have integrated this. This, for example, is an upper division course in the British novel. And then this is my favorite because it's, again, zeroing in on that social annotation work. So in this case, you're having students look at the Book Traces site and trying to identify what types of annotations they see. So is it alphabetic text? Is it drawing? Is it fabric or locks of hair? And then we consider how those translate into those modern social annotation platforms that I described. And what's really interesting is that I, as a composition rhetoric scholar, would consider those multimodal annotations, right? They're not just text, they're drawings, they're pieces of fabric, and all of the platforms we're using to teach students, like Hypothesis or Perusal, are also multimodal. You can embed images, you can hyperlink to outside sources, you can embed videos, right? And they also highly encourage that discussion. So one student posts a response, the other student replies, then you have an active or lively debate in the margins of that digital text. So I'm trying to connect students that multimodality is actually not new. Everything new is old, right? That multimodal annotation has been happening since before the 19th century, and that this is just, our current version of having that relationship to the text. What I'm trying to emphasize here is that reading is not an isolated solo experience where you're alone in your room reading a book, but instead, actually, we know this. People are posting on Twitter and Goodreads and talking about books on TikTok and Instagram, right? People are constantly talking about the books they read. And if we bring that into the classroom and we encourage that practice, right, we can really get a more rich discussion in the classroom through those asynchronous interactions that students are having. So this assignment here really guides the instructor through how to connect that social media, social annotation from the 19th century to using these new tools in their classroom, including sample guides, like video guides on how to use these tools. There's a guide to using Hypothesis right there that you see linked, and exact language to put on your course management system, right? Your Blackboard or your Canvas to kind of prompt the use of this thoughtfully by students. And there's even a guide of how to assess it, right? And how to, for lack of a better word, grade this kind of work once you implement it into your classroom. So now we actually want to look at some of the examples we found today. I am very happy to report that out of the 250 books we looked at today, we found some really wonderful examples and examples of everything we've talked about so far here today. And the students were incredibly deeply engaged. I can't wait to upload the new pictures to our slides for next time. Students were working together. They were really excited about what they found. We had one group who, up until about halfway through, had found only good examples. They didn't have any books that had nothing in them, right? So their hit rate was 100% until about halfway through. So I'm going to hold up a couple examples, but I want to start with the birthday book that we found here. So this, for example, was one of the birthday books that we found that the folks in the room will get to look at more closely. But in a group of students who happen to actually read and speak Chinese, found an example here of a Chinese celebrity who had written both in English and Chinese characters here. They pulled out their smartphone and Googled her and found out that she is a Chinese composer who went to Harvard, and the owner of this book also went to Harvard at the same time, so they were classmates. And once they found that example of someone who is a celebrity, they kept looking and found this book is full of celebrities that were all classmates at Harvard together. Again, this feels very much like social media, right? Like you could make a social network graph of everyone in this book and probably found out like almost everyone they Googled like had a Wikipedia page, right? From this birthday book. We also did find this flower here. I'm going to show you the screen, right? This flower here. And what I think is really lovely about this example and very appropriate to our moment is that this flower is on a page that says, being confined to school, one pleasant morning in spring, which feels very much like this moment right now, right? When we're all confined to school. And again, shows you that the flowers aren't just randomly placed in here, but very thoughtfully placed next to a poem that is of that theme. Should we turn it?
The other thing I would say is about, we estimate about 25% of the books today, probably 1 in 4 had something, but so much higher than our normal range. And the other thing is that, how did these books get here? Well, the history of Penn has moved most of its older books off-site to a storage facility called Libra. So we initially came here, I initially came earlier this year to do a little initial search in the stacks, and we realized very quickly, these books aren't there anymore. They've been moved to offsite. And so thanks to the people at Libra, we had to put in a request. Well, we need 250 books to be brought back from storage. And so we kind of hand selected these two. I did stack the deck a little. These are all books of poems that I kind of predicted would have writing. They're the kinds of books that I was talking about in my presentation. But we weren't disappointed in the sense that, yes, that was right. About a quarter of these had marks that can be definitively traced to 19th century readers and owners, and the students loved looking at them.
You can see here that I've brought some examples from today up. So this is that birthday book that I was just talking about. So students were able to immediately submit their book, document what they found, and upload it to our site. So our results are instantaneous in that way. And it was very simple for students to upload. So even though this only happened, an hour ago, we're able to demonstrate their findings right here on the Book Traces site. And it is searchable by institution. So you can search all of the Penn results right here on the site. And you can see what they found in just a short amount of time with a small number of books that we were able to bring back. It's also kind of amazing that something like the flower is still there, right? Because these books were in the circulating stack, then sent to Libra, then brought back, and the flower remains, right? So it's interesting to think about what how kind of journey these books have traveled on, and yet still remain rich resources of this information.
Often moved, never opened, you think?
Pretty much, yeah, that's right. That book actually has another flower, and it has like 3 flowers. But, so that's kind of our presentation. There's a lot more we could say, but we'd like to leave time for questions and discussion. So we will end there. Thank you so much.
Just to clarify, go to the Book Traces site. There are, I think, what is it, about 3,500 images of books that have been found.
That's right. And the students, they upload like 50 from Penn today. There's all, if you go to the site now, it's all Penn on the first 50 books.
Thank you so much. This is wonderful. And open for questions, comments. Yes.
Thank you so much. This was like fast. I have 2 questions. The first is I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the logging process, and especially I can see that you're having students sort of upload when they find one on a page. Are you also sort of logging books where they find nothing?
Well, go ahead. I mean, yes.
Yeah, so using the Book Traces site itself, we basically just have, we ask students to categorize their findings into 3 piles. One is what we would call high. So there's definite examples of something from the 19th century. There's usually a date or a name that we can trace, and we know that it's from the 19th century. Also, we do a lot of work with students telling them what we're not looking for, like we're not looking for red pen and highlighter, for example, right? So that they can identify, and we show them examples in advance. So those high categories are something we're 100% sure have something in it. We then have a medium pile where there's definitely markings, but we're not sure if they're from the 19th century. Maybe there's just like 1 or 2 markings, but not clear. And then we have an absolutely nothing pile. So using the site, we ask them only to upload those that are high, that we are 100% sure there's something in it. But we actually, Kristen Benson, as part of the Mellon grant, also developed an app, which we have tested with the board, where you can actually like tag books high, medium, or none. So that in the UVA collection, we know exactly which books don't have anything in it so that we are not returning those books.
Yeah, and that app is basically, you have to get it preloaded with data from the library. So you basically request the MARC record to the book you want to look, you load it into the app, and then students are looking for specific books on shelf. So they can mark not on shelf or high, medium, low, and then they can do whatever. So there you're actually collecting structured data. Booktraces.org is just like, I spotted a bird in the wild.
Right.
But there are ways to collect structured data, which we've done at a lot of institutions as part of these grants. The problem is, what do you do with that data once you've got it? And we've been trying to get a larger library collective interested in this, and someone who could manage this data, like an OCLC or a HOPI or something like that, where you could say, okay, let's put a little book traces flag on those records. But it would have to be not just a local MARC record, because you want it to be visible outside the institution as a kind of national union catalog of book traces books. So these are the things I dream about, but I can't build myself. And so we've been trying to like get enough traction that some larger library organization would say, what a great idea, linked open data, let's flag book traces books that have been identified as such, and therefore make it safe.
And if you look back on the booktraces.org pedagogy site, you will see that there we did temporarily release that data so that digital humanists could play with it. And it says you'll note that it says that it's temporary because we then had to stop so we could upload more data, right? And keep working on it. But we did have that released, and we did have DH classes playing with it, doing some of that network visualization, and it's definitely a rich area to develop on.
No, I was just gonna ask a simple question. What's the minimum amount of information you're looking for? An inscription with a date that's 19th century, is that sufficient for you to say that's a?
Very good question. So we've worked a lot on thresholding because we didn't want to get too much and we didn't want to get too little. So yes, basically it has to have, for book traces, well, this is open to debate. And if we did a national, some kind of standard, we would have to have a longer conversation about what counts. But we decided it had to have a name and a date. Or if it were extensive and obvious 19th century can, we might include it. So there's some in the gray area, but if we couldn't do any more research on it, if it was basically just underlined, we're like, well, what do you do? Well, let's not count that because we don't know who made that or whatever.
Yeah.
But if it had an ownership inscription or a date or a name, any date would be enough because, okay, that's 19th century or early 20th. But that's actually a live area debate is what counts as a hit and what counts as not sufficient of interest. And it all depends on the kind of research question you might ask.
Yeah. And like, this is an example where there's a name and the date's been cut off, but it's looks like 1860 something.
Okay, that's good. And so then you're like, okay, I can imagine doing some genealogy on that person, figure out where this book was in their life. And as the students discovered today, a couple of them were like, oh my gosh, I've become the accidental cataloger of the Burr Library because this guy, William Burr, somebody donated a whole collection and they kept finding his books.
Lynn knows more about than anyone living. Yeah.
Right. So they were like, oh, so you're actually reuniting collections. So therefore, marginality starts to become interesting. Even if Burr only wrote a little bit in this one, if we're trying to do a whole picture of his reading, well,
That there's some other Burr family members who were writing and Burr never wrote.
yeah, other family members
Burr
did.
tends to write his books. I mean, because I think he was a collector who was
Or
looking for.
some other relative to her.
Yeah, there were
He had
family
a lot of
members.
his collection, I mean, a lot in rare, but also a lot in the circulating collection. He was a big donor to the library.
That makes sense. And that's what we're finding is we're kind of reuniting libraries that were dispersed across the different collections at a library. And that can tell you, that's just something that can tell you about the way it was built.
And also I'll say that you can see I put up the submission form because we're not asking them to document extensively what they found, right? We just want to capture the basics. So we really have to fill out a very simple form, take a couple of photos. You're not going to photograph every single page maybe you found some marginalia on because this often happens in the context of a class. We have about an hour and 15 minutes to do all of this with a class. So you want it to be very low barrier to entry, very quick and very painless, right?
Yeah, this site was built for pedagogy, basically. It wasn't really built as a research or, well, it helps me find things, but it wasn't built as a library model. It was really just sort of like, let's get some interest in this thing and get the wheels moving.
What, I mean, mean, what about, this is really fascinating. There's an advertisement, looks like a late 19th century advertisement for Wanamaker's put in the book. The owner put that in the book.
Right.
With a wonderful quote in it. I mean, will that count as a book trait?
Well, we have a category for pasted insertion, loose insertion. So we have all these different categories, and pasted insertion is one. Now, if that's the only thing in there, we might be like, yeah, it's a bookmark. I don't know, maybe
For
not.
me, it's totally fascinating.
Right. It kind of all depends on what your research question is, and that's the problem, is we almost want to say everything that might be interesting. There we are.
And the students themselves, although they know what we are looking for, right? They also find their own discoveries. They learn a lot about what does a 19th century text look like, what does it mean to hold a dilapidated book in your hands, how were they bound, how do they function. But like today, a bunch of students found the punch cards from libraries, and they were completely fascinated. Like, what is this punch card? How does this work? Like, why do they have these? And that's a great discussion to have with your professor as well, especially with the course. There you go, right? And other kinds of like interesting media objects that might not be our aim, but are worthwhile encounters.
We just have an excuse to put their hands on a lot of books, and that's hard to have exercises where you didn't hide Easter eggs that then they found. Here, they're actually doing original humanities research. We don't know what they're going to find, and that's fascinating.
We have a question from Jessica Linker.
What's the thing?
Jessica.
Oh, can I unmute myself? That's okay. So,
Yes.
so I just want to say this is a wonderful project, and I very much look forward to using this in my undergraduate classrooms, because I think they will be delighted about the idea of kind of getting to handle and describe something and look at it closely. So I have a question about leaves, and Andy, I was on a panel with you about like 10 years ago at SAA to talk about things in books, and I don't know if you remember this, but was very, very interested to see like if in the process of this project that you would be able to decode something more about leaves, because I haven't totally let up with my obsession with them, and I have about 200,000 pictures of leaves, like from like looking at various archives, and I guess I have tried to develop a way of like understanding like when is it just like a leaf in a book, when is it have a specific purpose, when is it at least in terms of my research, like part of a process, like the book is being used as an herbarium dryer, and when is it a hybrid of all of these things. Like Library Company definitely has a copy of Lindley Murray's English Reader, where someone has left leaves related to certain poems on particular pages, but then has included such a wide range of leaves that I thought it might be in preparation for an herbarium. And there's like a little slip of paper actually that has the binomial name. So it was in fact like, just a state in preparation for the leaves being moved elsewhere that just ended up that way. But it took me a really long time and looking at a lot of leaves to come up with like, here's how you read this. And I imagine like in the process of this project, right, like there must be like things that have emerged about inserts, like that have been clarified to you. And I'm just curious if like if you could either talk more about leaves or just about like ways of reading these things.
Well, no, it's a great question. I mean, the leaves, it's all overdetermined, right? Because in the 19th century, you have all these amateur botanizers that's happening. And then you have all this sort of florilegia, poetry of flowers, books. So flowers and books and leaves are kind of really overlapping in lots of different practices, as you say, scrapbooking, decorative arts, amateur botanizing, etc. And then also just bookmarks. People are reading outside and they'll throw a flower in there to mark their spot. So a lot of times you can't tell what it's doing there. And I've tried to be agnostic about it, but I'm also, as a literary interpreter, I'm always being like, well, but isn't the poem itself a flower? Isn't this anthology really a collection of, so I maybe have overdone it a little bit, but yeah, with one of the issues, sort of pretty associated, but one of the issues that comes up with those, as you see, is the damage that those plants do to the book. And the librarians that I was working with, the preservation librarians, are like, we need to remove that instantly because it is damaging the book. Well, then we went round and around, and maybe that was actually part of the book, and its value now is to leave it in place. But with inserts, generally, we split the difference. Sometimes we've moved them into an envelope at the back of the book with a note saying where that insert once was. But normally we just are leaving them there because these books aren't that valuable in the sense that what's giving them their value is precisely these kinds of evidence. But I don't have a fail-safe way of interpreting, what botanical material is doing. It really is a case-by-case basis, and a lot of times you can't tell at all. And like I say, I've gotten really interested in this design work, the way the flower and the leaf and the page kind of become a surface of their own that seems to be part of the point of putting it there.
D. Andrews.
Yes, hello there, and thank you. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me? Yeah. This is just a terrific talk. Believe it or not, I literally just wrote a memorandum to my campus library. I teach in one of the Cal State systems campuses, Cal State East Bay, here in the Bay Area, about the book collection. What are we going to do about the book collection? Because there's a new building opening for the library, which will only hold 10% of our collection. And the rest of the collection will be now in closed stacks in the old building, but the old building isn't seismically safe. So I'm very suspicious about what happens to the book collection. And believe it or not, also, we have a very fine general book collection with many older titles, not that many 19th century maybe, but certainly a lot of early 20th century, because the original committee that put together the library back in the early 60s went to book auctions, bought up lots of book lots. It's a really very fine collection of general books. And I have found inscriptions in our books, and I've made a note to myself about what they are. I work on anti-slavery, so some of them related to that subject matter. And I'm just really excited about your project because I think I'm going to report right back to the archivist and rare book and our special collections, which we have. We have the best probably collection of Bay Area poetry in all of California. I mean, you'd be amazed at the secrets held in California's libraries, both academic and public. They are astounding and very little known. I'm going to write to her right away about your project as a way to get students involved in books as physical things. And it amuses me because last week, the session on women book collectors, we talked a little bit about how being obsessed with perfect condition is not necessarily the best approach to book history, that in fact, books that are not in good condition may reveal more than books that are. So I think that you're also underscoring that. I had one minor question about this, which is, are you worried that you're encouraging students to write in library books? Though I have to say, they're not using them so much these days that maybe that is just a moot point. They're all so digitized now. But is there kind of a way that you can teach them the wonders of historical annotation at the same time that you're making sure they don't use those red markers too much?
Yeah,
That's my thoughts. Thank you again very, very much.
You draw a right line between writing in library books and writing your own books. And what would I say about that? Well, yeah, I mean, that's why the social annotation tools that Amanda uses is the outlet for that. One thing we thought about is, could we put a book in the library for them expressly to annotate and collect student annotations and then put that in the rare book room? My suggestion was Adwood's Handmaid's Tale. Could we put that out for like a semester, encourage everyone to annotate it, and then store it for later people to look at? So kind of guided and put a pencil around that kind of writing. But we always try to separate. You can write your own books, but you can't write in public property.
We start every session. We're specifically looking for annotations that were before the library, acquired the text.
Yeah.
We don't encourage you to write in the library book. These
Yeah.
were made while the book was in a personal collection, not as part of the
Could I
library.
jump in quickly with a historical question on this? is it not the case that actually the period you're studying is the moment when libraries are inventing themselves at places where you're not allowed to write in books?
Yeah.
And so it's kind of an interesting parallel track. The
Because everyone's
19th century
writing books,
library
right?
is becoming a place of don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. And you're tracing a much older and continuing practice of writing.
Well, it really, because it starts, parts of it is the circulating libraries of the 19th century, which are like the video stores of our earlier 20th. And so the same book would circulate to many readers. And they were very adamant that you should not be writing in these books. This is not your book. It's remember, you rented this, you didn't buy this, and someone else is going to read it. So please don't write. So there's a lot of that discourse gets going in a kind of private context, but not rather than public libraries. But then, of course, it's imported over to the public library.
But I mean, the line is to some extent a false one. So imagine the Smith College Library in 1880, right? And you have a woman student who is reading the library copy of Felicia Hemings. I mean, her response is as legitimate a document for you as somebody who has a private copy, and may in fact have an added layer of interest because she knows she's not supposed to be writing in the library copy.
That's right.
Nonetheless.
That's true, and that's a good point, Jerry. That a lot of times you can't tell actually whether it was in an institution. If it's 19th century annotation, it could have easily been in an institution. We don't know that for sure. So maybe I'm being a little bit too like dogmatic of bright line distinction, but yeah. And in fact, now that we've expanded our range to say HBCUs, and we're trying to look at working men's libraries and try to capture different kinds of populations instead of just the wealthy white people who donated books to major universities and colleges. Well, then you actually want the experience of the students at the school and how they were annotating the books that often started as textbooks anyway, and then ended up in the collection. So it's getting mushier as we get into the details.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful project, and I'm wondering how you move from the classroom pedagogical use to the kinds of work that you and me do in the book traces book, where you are, recovering lives of people who are not well known, but then they become, in some ways, they typify as sentimental, 19th century readers. So then, how do you scale out to think not only that 12.5% of books are annotated, but can you start thinking about are the annotations mostly from women versus men? Are the kinds of responses that you have from the 12.5% of women in New England, right? Are they going to be different from the 12.5% of women in the South or the West? And can you start building larger pictures from these individuals?
That's exactly where we'd love to go. And that's where you need more data, right? Because all we have is little bits and pieces. And so, but we'd love to be able to say, like, which books were most often given by men to women in the 1840s? Which books, with a lot of gift inscriptions as a whole category, which books were printed in the 1850s in this category, say medicine or whatever, were most likely to attract the pen of an annotator? And you can only really ask that with any statistical meaningfulness if you have a lot more books. So our next thing we've been trying to get going, or that we didn't get right now, is to work with Hathi Trust. They have about 1 million digitized 19th century books. About that, we worked with them and we got the number. They have about 950,000. Machine vision, spot marginalia, right? So the computer can tell you which page has handwriting on it with pretty good accuracy. They see the text block, but then it sees this weird thing over there. Well, then we could instantly have big data on which books from which years. Those books are all well cataloged. We could at least have a snapshot of that kind of data of use. Now, then you got to get into detail and tag for gender, location, and all of that. But my sense now is we don't have enough examples. Even if we elaborately tag the data we have, it would still just be a very few proportion of the actual books that are out there.
Thanks. This was great. I mean, all those examples are amazing. You could just write a novel about each one of them. And, I mean, I actually think I've talked about this sometimes with students in like the RP class. It's really hard to pinpoint, like, how long ago did someone have to have written in the book for it to go from like, we don't want you to do that to thank God you did that. It actually, I think it's actually just any time before now. And the we don't want you to do that is always looking to the future, like, don't do that. but even something last year, like, could be super interesting to
Yes.
find it in, you know. And most annotations don't obliterate the text, so I think there's an interesting history to be written about the prohibition on writing in books, and I do think it mainly goes back to like commercial lending bookstores and libraries in the 19th century, not to like public civic libraries. But anyway, the other question I had, the real question I had, was about that Google Books moment. I think that's a really fascinating moment.
Yeah.
Where, as you said, quite evocatively, like the books come back, but they have been transformed, even though hopefully nothing has actually happened to them in Google's hands. So, you know,
No, we don't know.
sometimes they did. You know, in early modern studies, this is a familiar story because the corpus, large amounts of the corpus of English printed books was microfilmed in the early 20th century and then digitized in the mid 1990s. And I'm interested in like what happens to our work when these things happen. When, like, in both these cases, one copy comes to stand in for a whole edition, or sometimes even, I suspect even more so in 19th century, the whole work, right? Like there's one copy that people will read now to be what a Longfellow book was.
Yeah.
And I think it enables a lot of kind of, I mean, the early English books online came out, and really, my hunch is it propelled new historicism in early modern studies, because it's suddenly super easy to like find 10 books on witches and put them together, you know. And similarly, Google Books really propelled DH, right? A lot that kind of text mining stuff and distant reading stuff and all that. So I'm curious what your experience has been about how, in your field, the kind of massive digitization and then the consequent effects in libraries and on us, like click, I never, you know, like even I have to stack stuff.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Well, you know, I say this in the book, but this project happened at the right moment. It couldn't have happened 10 years earlier because Google Books didn't exist, and therefore we never could have found out who these people were. Like the fact that those students could find out that Chinese celebrity in 5 seconds, that actually makes a big difference, because if you're just looking at names and then you're like, I'll never figure out who that is. But Google Books had come out and made all this stuff accessible. First thing we found, it all started with a book of poetry that had a little poem written in the back. And we were like, oh, this is probably a published poem by the same author. No, we Googled it, it didn't come up. And therefore we knew it was an original composition. And therefore we knew that the mother was mourning her daughter in the book, and everything went from there. But if we had done the project 10 years earlier, we would have looked at that and been like, well, somebody wrote in the book, I don't know what this means. And if we had done it 10 years later, all those books were moved off site and were not available for that kind of casual browsing like it's been done here at Penn. So we're kind of occupying this window where the digital totally enabled this project. Obviously, look, we're showing you all these digital images. We're on Zoom right now. We're collating we're able to find lots out that we could, with genealogy and Google, that we couldn't have otherwise found. But it's having this downstream effects on where the books are going.
And it really, I think this conversation is what students can really dig their teeth into in understanding the role of research libraries and their access to materials as students and what that means. So again, I first taught this in New York City at the very moment when New York Public Library was moving everything off site and redoing the main branch on 42nd Street, right? Where there was actual students from across New York City standing in front of the library with signs protesting this happening, right? So it made this conversation so much more real and so much more visceral. And, you know, in the case of UVA, you have Alderman Library is actually either being redone and things are being moved off site. When Andy came maybe in January, and we actually looked in the stacks here first to see if we could successfully do a stack search, and the answer is no. There's not enough on the stacks here right now for us to do this. We had to bring them back from Libra. So when my students hear these conversations and I think through these questions, they're always like, oh, this is like Fahrenheit 451. People are burning the books, like they're destroying the books, right? And they get really passionate about how they want access to these books and they want circulating collections. And isn't that kind of what we want students to want?
The hard part is going to
Not
modulate this
necessarily, man. The
conversation.
librarians actually don't really necessarily want that.
I think we want students to want to access books and do this work.
Well, you can't do a stack search at Libra, not only because you have to get out to Libra, and the students aren't really allowed to do that, but also the books are like 50 feet up in the air, so you can't.
I'm not convinced at all that a lot of my colleagues in professional research libraries want what you just say they want. I don't think that's true.
Well, that's a good debate too then, right?
Sure,
It's
it's a
about
really
like,
important debate.
what role does the library play and what do we want it to play moving
Yeah,
forward? That's a great question.
I mean, I'd like to talk about the materials are off-site, okay, so we're not finding them, but presumably materials are also being deaccessioned because these are, from a library perspective, these might be junky books, right? And so here I have in front of me, you know, a very acidic copy of the poetical works of Sir Walter Scott, a new edition published by Boston, Philip Sampson and Company, 1853. So this was obviously saved. So the library did not say we have a better edition of the poetical works of Sir Walter Scott. We don't need this. So they did save this. But how do we know that they didn't have 3 copies of this edition? And they saved the cleanest one, right? I mean, we have no sense of what has been lost, and the prejudice for clean copies has presumably from from good motives on the part of librarians. I mean, we've lost these very fragile sources.
Yeah, that's not if Book Traces makes one intervention in the library policy conversation, it would be as we manage down our print collections, don't just prefer the clean copy, but think about maybe preserving a clean copy and then maybe a heavily annotated, like not be the clean copy is the only the blue chip standard.
But how do you convince a librarian to preserve, let's say, all 3 copies of this edition if they happen to have 3 copies of it?
And right now, the argument is that we're not going to preserve those extra copies of Libra. And we have this whole discussion because, of course, we can, say, oh, we'll keep 2 copies maximum, or sometimes 1 copy.
Yeah,
And so this is a big issue around these kinds of books because the library itself is already saying, oh, we see we already have 2 copies. We're going to get rid of the 3rd copy, and we're not really going to look at the other copies to see if they're what kind of condition they're in either.
That's right. And it's
You know,
hard to
that's,
do,
I mean,
yeah.
I'm just speaking for what
Now
I've
we're gonna
heard.
get rid of the clean copy. And
What?
say, like it
But
used to
they-
be, get
they're
rid of
not
the
even-
marked up copy, now we're gonna get rid of the clean
I
copy.
know,
But
right.
they're not
Buy
even
the marked up
looking at-
copies.
they're not even looking.
Well, no one
at
even
copies.
opens the
Yeah.
book. That's
No
the
one
thing.
even
It's all
looks at it.
happening.
They just see, oh, we have 2 copies. They don't even make sure we actually do have 2 copies. They just base it off a record. And a lot of times,
Yeah.
there may not be a copy there.
Maybe that's where bringing students into the stacks and kind of performing these traces could help digitize some of these texts. And, we're only collecting a small subset, but we've done amazing examples in history, like battle schematics written in books that soldiers have brought onto the battlefield.
Yeah, it's not
right?
just poetry.
Right,
Yeah.
really fascinating example. So if you think about many classes and many instructors bringing their students into the stacks to do this kind of work before they're sent off site, or bringing them back for a specific set of call numbers to do it, then we could create rich resources of these before they're due.
I mean, I would respond quickly to D that I'll bet you when you talk to your special collections librarian, they'll share your enthusiasm and agree with everything you said. But if you talk to the rest of the librarians, maybe those are the people that you actually need to talk with, because no one in special collections will be shocked by this.
This is it. In fact, every time, all those schools we visited, that long list, almost every case, it was a special collections librarian who invited us, because they're the ones who kind of get right away that basically we're blurring the line between special and general collections.
Right.
What we're saying is the 19th century, it's a weird category because it got just old enough into the new millennium. We realized, wait, now we're 2 centuries away from this. This stuff is starting to seem old and interesting. And yet, look how much there is, and it's in terrible shape, and it's not worth anything. And so we may just be at the time of the great winnowing of the 19th century record, and we're going to lose 75% of it as institutional resource. And so I used to rip my heart out for that, but now kind of like that's where we are. So now it's just like, okay, well, which 25% are we going to say? And I just want to alter that conversation a little bit to say, can we look at the books? Can we actually look at them and see before we make that decision? And I know that's
Doesn't
hard.
sound too crazy, right?
Well,
It costs time and money.
costs time and money. That's where the
those are
students
not
come.
very-
And exactly, it's people power, right? You need
Yeah.
people, which is why we, if every course in the department had their students do
There
this,
was a
you could
place
go
to
through a
put the
lot of
data.
them.
But you also need the shelf space, right? I mean,
Yeah,
Actually,
we're
you know
over
what?
shelf space.
My hope that some of this will be saved is it turns out to be a fairly high amount of work to get rid of stuff.
That's good.
Now, if I'm right, some stuff will be saved because it's too much work to trim it out. I may be
It's
wrong.
more
I mean, your
about
point is an
additional
important
things being taken out and discovered that, oh, this is the fourth copy or the third copy, let's just get rid of it. Those are the kinds of decisions,
Yeah.
so if something's still.
Look, I mean, I remember when I was in school, I had a part-time job in the departmental library, and I was outraged when one of the other graduate students who had a part-time job in the library said we have to throw out all the 19th century editions of Wordsworth and whatever that we have on the shelf. And I said, no, you can't do that. These are old books, they're valuable. And we had a little set too, and then we went to the faculty advisor, who was an eminent Shakespearean, who had control over the library. He said, yeah, these are worthless books, get rid of them.
Which proves that, you know, this is, yes, not a new problem.
Not a
right.
new problem. And, you know, and in some ways, you know, it was a departmental library with very limited shelf space, and there were new books coming in all of the time, right? Nobody was looking for 19th century editions of Wordsworth.
Well, and these
Yeah.
books are sort of useless,
yeah.
sponsored by anyone. They're not, you know, I love them, but no one reads them anymore, and they're not bibliographically, in the traditional old school bibliographic sense, interesting. You know what I mean? They're not first editions. They are machine press. You have to be outside the normal main line of bibliographic studies to find these.
But I mean, but like steering things around, if you have questions, but steering things around, I'm talking about their usefulness in the classroom. But and if you know that that 19th century readers of Felicia Hemans were particularly likely to annotate their copies, right? Then you're writing about the reception of Felicia Hemans by women readers in the 19th century. You now know that you can start culling large numbers of 19th century copies from the remote storage of a whole lot of libraries. You start building up your database. That is, I mean, you.
By culling, you mean collecting, not.
Well, by going to the library and, yeah, I mean, collecting and looking through that, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you have a kind of indication of a methodology you can follow for scholarship, and a very pointed one, right? Because you look at certain texts or certain kinds of texts that you think are going to give you a window. Yeah, not so much into an individual life of somebody who's not famous, but into classes of readers, right? So Adam Shear has his hand raised. Adam.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Chair. So this is very interesting to me. I mean, a brief personal anecdote involving the Penn Library. When I was a graduate student studying in Van Pelt, coming up on 25 years ago, I remember a project to deaccession extra copies of things that were sort of popular undergraduate texts in the 50s and 60s, just before the course packet became a big thing, when students would read through a whole paperback. And I remember, I think it was one of the classic books on the Enlightenment. I can't remember which one now, but one of the things, and there were 8 copies on the shelf in Van Pelt, and it seemed reasonable to me that Van Pelt didn't need all 8. But what I noticed was that the ones that were flagged were to be deaccessioned were the ones with those underlinings and student notes from the 50s and 60s. And so I actually took the clean copy and the flag copy down and demanded to speak to the head of this project, who just dismissed me out of hand without any consideration. And I said, well, what about the historian of education 100 years from now who might like to see what Penn undergrads of the 50s and 60s were, or the 70s or the 80s were underlining? And there was no traction to that argument. So I guess that kind of leads to, I have 2 questions. So it kind of leads to my first one, which is, with all due respect, maybe this is the material text seminar is not the right audience, and associate university librarians are the right audience. And so I do wonder if you have plans to see if you can get sort of take an advocacy position in the library world. That sounds tongue in cheek, but I'm actually quite serious because I do really think this issue of copy specific importance is important, and beginning to think of these, let's say, pre-1920 materials as archival special collections is going to be important down the road. The second question, I guess, actually pushes at that idea of what is a rare book, or what is a special collection, or what is an early printed book, maybe from the other direction. And maybe I just missed this in your talk. So I'm someone who works on something similar for hand press era Hebrew books. It's the Footprints Project, which is, I guess, in some ways a cognate project yours. And we love to talk to you about metadata and standards someday. But although I think we've got, so I guess maybe this is self-interested in terms of question about overlap between the eras. And someone else mentioned early modern. There are lots of early modern projects like this now. But I am wondering, what is your, do you have an ending point, which I gather is the copyright, the pre-1923 endpoint. Do you have a starting point? I mean, are you looking at, I mean, if a book were 1810, 1790, and it's in the special collections room and not the stacks, if somehow another personal anecdote will be that if you go into Sterling Memorial Library at Yale, gosh, it's Yale. They've got so many rare books for Beinecke that there are plenty of 18th century books, or at least there were 30 years ago, 18th century books on the open shelves in Sterling Library. Maybe not anymore, but what would you do in that case with so I guess I'm interested in the earlier end of your period as well.
That's a good question. We did do a little thing at Sterling, and you're exactly right. They had a lot of early books there. There's really no early terminus. Well, you've got my Latin backwards. There's no place where it's just that most of those books are no longer in the stacks. It's true at certain Ivy League institutions, you'll find 18th century book here and there. Every now and then we'll find the 1790s that slip the net, but in most cases, everything's been after the 18th century is what remains on the stacks, but before that is already in a rare book room. And there's just vanishingly few pre-1800 books that are still in circulating stacks. But we would admit them. And in fact, I think if you look on booktraces.org, there's one or two books from the 1790s that we found. So yeah, that's just our sense that those books are rare and probably will end up in rare book rooms, but it's this industrial book that we ended up focused on. In terms of the library stuff, yeah, I gave a keynote at RBMS a number of years ago. There's another, it's the rare book and manuscript section of the ALI. I've been trying, I was about to give a talk at CRL right before COVID hit. And that was going to be my big entree into the Center for Research Libraries. Greg Yao is interested in book traces, but it's just hard to get everyone's attention. COVID kind of really threw the thing for a loop because librarians are just trying to stay open and keep the lights on. I don't have time for this, but we would like to, if you have connections with the library world, this is a thing we need an advocate. We need someone who has a seat at those tables.
Well, not to mention, I think that the digital reality of COVID has either made you more important or more esoteric and weird, depending on how you look at it.
Yeah, more weird.
Less, that happy trust link has never mattered so much as it did for the last few years.
We all became used to for a couple of years now working with print and not being able to do this kind of searching. And so I don't know. We're kind of poised right now to figure, will there be more grant money for this kind of work? Will libraries have an appetite for it going back to once the stacks are open, say, yeah, we would like to spend more money on our 19th century books. That's essentially what we're asking is more investment in cataloging, preservation, retention. All of those things cost money, and so we're trying to make the case that that is a task, almost an ethical responsibility of the library, but really just that it's good for the library, it's good for scholarship, if we preserve that bibliodiversity.
But it's not just the large research universities, it's what's happening at a lot of smaller colleges too, with getting rid of things. And it's also the problem with something like WorldCat, where someone says, oh, I see all these copies, but they don't realize half the copies are, that people have gotten rid of them and haven't updated WorldCat, that there are things in there. Sometimes it's the microform you're seeing most of the time and you don't even realize that there's all kinds of issues around that, and people have to make assumptions about how many copies exist, and those are quite erroneous, as you know, but I just don't think people think enough about that.
And honestly, we've been presenting on this. I think we presented at STS in 2016, 17. We've been presenting on this for a long time. And I think the pandemic we had people reaching out to us saying, like, how do we do this in our class still when we don't have access to our libraries and we can't bring students into the stacks, which is how this pedagogical site develops. And for me, that's like, this is the value of the fact that we've digitized all of these examples, right? Is that people can still do this work because they have access to booktraces.org, and we've been doing this for so long.
Yeah. But we have been preaching to the choir. I think that point, that's who wants to hear us preach, is the choir. And in fact, the few times I've been able to address a larger library audience, they don't like it too much. That is, I've made some enemies, but people who are sort of like, you're telling us how to do our job, you understand the resources, limitations we're against. You have a very niche interest, and it should not be driving policy at all. And so I've been trying to say, look, what we need to do is engineer better conversations between librarians and faculty. This whole project is predicated on deep collaborations between library people, humanities content specialists, students, everything. And yet we're not good at talking about it across those divides, professional divides, because a lot of humanities faculty don't know enough about libraries to talk intelligently about them. And so they do say offensive things or things that are unrealistic. And a lot of librarians don't really want to hear our little interests are driving policy. That doesn't make sense either. So I don't know, but I'd be interested in that, in having larger conversations across those lines and thinking about what this looks like.
And it's also important to note that we're not against the digital, we're actually advocating for digitizing these, right? That if we can capture these and digitize them, that we give greater access to them, but then we can still be destroyed. I mean, right? Because like you said, that's an inevitability that we have to face in terms of just sheer storage space, right? I mean, the Library of Congress has bought how many extra buildings now to store their collections? We know this is a real problem, and that's why we're saying, let's look, let's photograph them, let's put them up on the site, and then.
It's also worth saying, though, that the 19th century is over, and they aren't making any more books from that period.
Yeah.
So it's a finite number of books. And it's an actual, you can actually do the math and say, this is a manageable problem. It's maybe 12 million books.
Really good point.
It's not that many. If you, in a sense, you could get your arms around
The
it.
growth is just, the growth is.
The growth is the stuff that's going forward. If people cared enough, if we just all hold hands and believe, we could save the 19th century. But it's an edge case. Again, not that many people care about these books. They're the orphans of lots of different, no readers, no bibliographic, no value.
Yeah, but then again, why is pre-1923 going to be more interesting, more worthwhile for than 1932? I mean,
Right. I'm hoping there'll be a book traces project after. Like I want there to be somebody with a different name that does everything from 1920 to 1965. That'll be an amazing book traces project, but it can't be me.
Like with any good DH project, you need to define your scope, right? Because you have chronic scope creep, the project can grow in both, in every direction, but we have to say, these are the books we're looking at for these reasons for this project, but you could do this for any other given set of dates.
Closing comment.
Well, we've been talking at the level of big policy, but I wanted to get back to like the marginalia itself, because the really striking one of that, I can't remember, the Geraldine, I think, where they're like, I don't believe her, and then someone, And I take your point about the analog to social media, and I think that points out an important continuity, though there's also something different about what they're doing there. And I was just thinking, it's not a style of marginalia that I can think of in the early modern period.
Yeah.
You do get marginalia in fictional works and drama and poetry, but you don't get that kind of direct response. It's that kind of marginalia you would find in like a religious polemic, where someone would write like, I don't agree. So I just wonder if you could speak briefly to like, what have you discovered about the way that people read their poetry that surprised you, even as a specialist in that field?
Yeah, your point, you're right. I mean, they're obviously learning it from the Protestant tradition in general. There's something about how you respond to the text. And so there's various habits of mind. One is commenting on the parables, commenting on the character. Another you'll see them doing this book is kind of just taking a statement and treating it as a freestanding proposition and then commenting on whether or not they agree with that. Or so forget it. It's not like in context. Like
That's classic kind of commonplace thing.
yeah, exactly. Commonplacing, commenting on character, applying it to one's own life, and those little date stamps and things like that. Going back to one's own annotations, that's interesting too. Those layers, I didn't expect that people would re-annotate their own annotations, and it's not just a one-time event. So temporal layerings.
Or like when she's speaking to I think he's dead.
Yeah.
And using this, this idea that books would be a place where you would do that.
Yes.
I don't think that's true in that way earlier, and I also don't think people are doing that now.
I was gonna say that also leaves us at some point.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's this medium moment where the book is the most interesting thing in the room. It's the portal. It's the closest thing you have to a way to contact other people. There's no telephone, there's no radio, there's no connect to but the book as a kind of cross-temporal existence, and so writing in it, seeing in it, and I don't know, I feel like I haven't really theorized it enough, but I try to talk about this in the book, about sort of what these marginalia tell us about what reading was as a kind of alien activity, something we don't quite recognize. We recognize parts of it. Parts of it's very familiar, but parts of it are like, wow, that's how they read. That's strange. And not just read, but used a book as a thing, as a repository for not just flowers and scrap and clippings, but for their thoughts, for their, for hair. I don't know. They're different kinds of objects. I think that I don't really use books that way myself, and I think most of us don't.
And the way that they pass them back and forth, right? Like you take it for the next month and then give it back to me for a month, and then I'm gonna give it back to you, and we're writing notes back and forth to each other. That's the way I see it. Like social annotation can really work, and other social platforms that we talk about books, but they're passing it back and forth, not just in
Well, one
unilaterally.
of your categories, I mean, when you do get all the money you deserve, and is that to track how many books were physically shared, if you can tell by multiple writing. Well, I'm sure you know this already in your literature. That would be it.
Multiple writers and different dates, and across to how long of a time was the active life of the book, and you can tell that. And so they become an interesting little research project. And that's where the student stuff can come in. It's not just finding them, but then okay, do a deep dive into this and unpack the secret life of this object.
Well, I think we could go on forever, and I would love to, but I think we also need to give you both a rest, especially if you've been at it all day. And just want to thank you.
Clean up the mess.
So much.
And feel free to come up and look at the examples. Thanks to everyone on Zoom. Sorry I didn't really look at the chat much, so I hope we didn't miss it.
Whitney has proposed the forest home for retired infirm actors, but for books. Yes.
I love it. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.